Hello again and welcome to the Gospel of Mark. You know, it's almost sad for us as we're looking at the last 6 programs in this series. We're very glad that you've been with us. We hope that you're enjoying the course as much as we are. And that would mean Father Mike Lastiri, who is the Director of Worship for the Diocese of Fresno and Pastor of Immaculate Heart of Mary Parish in Hanford, and Dr. Robert Maldonado from California State University, Fresno Philosophy Department, both of them truly lovers of the Gospel of Mark and enjoying this chance to break open each week a different chapter. We're looking now at chapter 12, and I'd like to have Robert, if he could, look at the selections that are coming up and put them in some context, Robert.
Well, we've exited the triple, and the controversies are starting to mount. And of course, these are from the perspective of the narrative, are setting up the passion, the kind of conflict between the religious authorities in Jerusalem and Jesus. And so it intensifies in this last part of the gospel with the various controversies between Jesus and the religious authorities.
What we're going to do now then is have Father Mike tell us if there's anything, Father Mike, that you have been doing by preaching while you're working with us here. You also have the pleasure of preaching on Mark. What's the connection for you?
Well, again, working with Mark in sense of reminding people of their responsibility to those who are powerless, for those in society who find themselves outside the comfort structures that we have, and how Mark speaks to that, and how do we respond to such? How do we, as everyday disciples, baptized, empowered, reach out to those who cannot care for themselves, and to have a sense of sympathy, but that's not more than that, but how do we call to action? And how does our action for justice, especially those in our own communities that are most vulnerable?
It's great to see the gospel not a piece of literature from 2,000 years ago, but a text that challenges us in our daily lives. Thank you very much, Father Mike and Robert. Robert, could you take the text? The first one we're going to work with is the question concerning tribute to Caesar. Could you read Mark's version?
And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to entrap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and care for no man, for you do not regard the position of men, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, Why put me to the test? Bring me a coin and let me look at it. And they brought one and he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were amazed at him.
Father Mike, what's the first thing that we just can't miss with Mark's treatment of this very charged question?
Once again, I think we're up against authority figures who are coming at Jesus, questioning him, wondering what he's thinking. There's a sense here of entrapment. How can they entrap him if he has been challenging them? We have both Sadducees and Pharisees. We have one group that supports the paying of taxes, and of course it's a political game. How do they survive the Roman occupation? One group is going to want to be on the side to collaborate in order to exist. The other side is willing to be troublesome and say no. Paying tax means, if you will, not necessarily giving up your religion, but in ascending to another, if you will, and Caesar, of course, represents for the Roman people almost a deity, so therefore there's that whole controversy that's going on. And so Jesus is dragged into this political mess, if you will, that's going on. It's a political mess that we always find ourselves when we are in a country that either as strangers or if we're occupied. And Jesus has been dragged into this. And so the whole question is, which side is he going to fall in? How will then he be either treated by the religious communities that are also at odds with themselves, And of course, you got to deal with the Roman people or the Roman authorities who are looking, is this going to be a fellow who's going to cause a rebellion?
Robert, anything left? That seems to be a really good run through the whole passage. Anything else you want to highlight?
Just to continue on that, the sort of setting up of the reign of God as in opposition to the reign of the world. And so that the discipleship of following Jesus, according to Mark, is this discipleship of a house that has no fathers, that has no hierarchy, and so that sort of hierarchyless house is been consistently set over and against institutions of hierarchy in Mark, of which Rome is the preeminent example. And so it is kind of nice how Jesus does sort of very cleverly set himself against the hierarchy of Rome without sort of baldly just saying Rome is over. Because in Mark, Jesus does not ever seem to want to get too political directly in terms of military or other kinds of action. It's very political, obviously, everything is, but not in the sort of direct political action way where he would say, stop paying taxes.
What's so interesting that I found out is that in the early church, it was not a simple thing. In fact, some of the scriptures are going to lead us to be quite subservient and quite paying our taxes and obeying Caesar, and governments are good, it says. On the other hand, there's this other more tentative approach that is a lot less complicit with the powers that be. And it is great to pick up in Mark here Jesus' ability to be subtly resistant and therefore able not to be entrapped, but also to give a direction that's a bit challenging for us even today, 2,000 years later. Now, the next passage is another one of these controversies, the question regarding the resurrection. Father Mike, can you read that?
Certainly. And the Sadducees came to him who said that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but leaves no child, the man must take the wife and raise up children for his brother. There were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and when he died, left no children. And the second took her and died, leaving no children, and third likewise. And the 7 left no children. The last of all, the woman, also died. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as wife. Jesus said to them, Is not this why you are wrong, that you know neither Scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given to in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong.
Robert, a lot here, the opening thought might be this concept of resurrection. How prevalent was it among the Jews of this time? And what else in this passage do you want to help us uncover?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is it was not prevalent, or it was at least contested. The idea of the resurrection of individual people is a relatively new idea in the time of Jesus. It's probably at most a century and a half old, which is actually not that old, especially for conservatives. And what's interesting here is that the Sadducees are the conservative party here, and it's odd for us to think about that, I suppose, from a religious perspective, to think that the denial of the resurrection is actually the conservative position, as opposed to the Pharisees being the more liberal and open to the new ideas. And so I often tell my students that's why they were sad, you see. But no, it's an interesting thing, and on this one, Jesus clearly sides with the Pharisees, which were also open to the idea, this new idea of resurrection, and so it's also interesting though from the marriage side. because it's in, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage. They are like angels in heaven, and this is a difficult passage to interpret, but it's interesting in how it seems to be, at least from a heaven's perspective, saying that marriage is not the norm, and that somehow that has implications for the walk in Mark's community too. And that's why I said in that earlier passage with prohibition of divorce, there seems to be some tension between that passage and this passage, because this passage seems again to be saying, you neither marry or are taken in marriage. And so that kind of, again, hierarchy of patriarchal marriage seems to be being rejected in this passage.
Father Mike, the next reading is...
Just back on the resurrection thing too, sorry to interrupt. The interpretation of the scripture, that's another reason why the Sadducees were conservative, because nowhere in what was probably the accepted Bible of the time, or at least by the Sadducees, were there any clear references to resurrection. They show up in Isaiah and in Daniel, but most scholars would hold those passages date from about the mid-2nd century BCE. And so again, 150, 200 years earlier, when this doctrine is developing, is when those texts date from, and the Sadducees probably wouldn't have accepted them. And again, Mark has Jesus, or Jesus himself probably did this, I would imagine, uses the Exodus passage, I am the God, which again, if you think about this from a kind of philosophical perspective, if you don't really believe in the doctrine of resurrection, there's no reason to see that passage as supporting resurrection in any clear way. But if you do, it sort of does. And so Mark's community clearly does as well.
It seems that one thing that's where we should be making clear, there was a vibrant Jewish life at the time of Jesus. And the very fact that there can be all this controversy among the different religious groups just shows that it was not what we sometimes misunderstand, a very dull, very negative, and a very, 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 very shallow time in Jewish life. It was a vibrant, rich time when there was a lot of thought. Now, they're telling us we have to take our break, so when we come back, we'll be looking at the other passages of chapter 12. So stay tuned.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Hello and welcome again to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12. Father Mike, there's that passage that is read on the 31st week of the year, B, so you'll have a chance to preach on it this year again, the Great Commandment. Do you want to give us a quick read on that one?
And then one of the scribes came up and heard him disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked them, which commandment is the first of all? Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And the scribe said to him, You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and there is no other but he. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, You are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared to ask any question.
As usual, Robert, there's going to be something peculiar, something special in this passage of Mark. Where is it for you?
Well, remember in Mark, the teacher title is not a positive one. And in the previous passage where the scribes the Sadducees and the Herodians are coming to trap him, Mark sets them up, obviously, as very negative. They're trying to trick him with the tribute to Caesar question. And they, too, call him teacher. And then in the resurrection passage we just looked at, too, that this kind of continues. And so this scribe is, again, calling him teacher, but clearly the scribe is a kind of positive character. And so this may be the only case in Mark where a character addresses Jesus as teacher when they are not doing or about to do a bad thing. And what's interesting about it to me is that he actually adds to what Jesus says. The much more than whole burnt offerings and sacrifices, and Jesus sees that he answers wisely, and so and says he's not far from the kingdom of God. And so this scribe is wise. He's putting things, he adds to Jesus, and Jesus commends him, and so he's sort of not like the others. And in this respect, he's kind of like in Matthew. There's scribes who are trained for the kingdom of heaven. And so scribe usually comes off in the Gospels as a sort of singular negative, hypocritical, bad stereotype. And in this case, Mark does that mostly, but here subverts it a little.
The next passage is also read on the 32nd Sunday of Year B. So we're seeing passages that do come up in our lectionary every third year. That'll be the passage about David's son. It's very brief. I wonder if, Robert, you can read it, and Father Mike, if you can unpack it a little.
Maybe I'll go to the 40 then. And as Jesus taught in the temple, he said, "How can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, declared, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put thy enemies under thy feet.' David himself calls him Lord, so how is he his son?" And the great throng heard him gladly. And in his teaching he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to go about in long robes and to have salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation."
When you preach on this year, Father Mike, where are you going to go?
Well, first of all, seeing Jesus identified, if you will, with the house of David. Sometimes people say, well, there it is. All of a sudden Mark is identifying Jesus coming from the Messianic line, especially with David as the great king of the Old Testament who led his people successfully or unsuccessfully, depends who it is, but certainly the rising of the temple and everything else. Deeper than that, I think, though, is how David saw his own role in his own time, and Jesus sees his role in his own time. Whether or not, whatever connections we can make between the two, both were strong figures, both delivering their people from another world. If you will, David in his own time, in his own temporal way, rescuing his people Israel, setting up the kingdom, and of course the building of the temple, which is a spiritual symbol too for people. It unites them into the one God. Jesus on the more spiritual realm, if you will, messianic in the sense that he doesn't necessarily going to be the temple but the reign of God. It's going to be a whole different kind of spiritual centerness, and that Jesus continues to carry on. And so if he calls himself Lord, then when we use that term for Jesus, it's trying to kind of, Mark is there trying to once again, if you will, emphasize and bring out the role of Jesus as of everything we've seen and where we are going, if we're going to give that sense of importance to down the line to the passion and the eventual resurrection. Who is Jesus in this?
And the passage, Robert, about the critique of the scribes who this time do get a lashing from Jesus. What import do you see, and what message for us today?
Well, I think the key verse is 37, actually. The great throng heard him gladly. And so why would the crowd be happy about what he said about David, which is what the immediate context of that is? And so in the David passage, it's almost as if Jesus is rejecting that he is the son of David, because the Messiah can't be the son of David, because the son of David would be an inferior, because the Father is superior to the Son. And yet Jesus is the son of David, or at least the text seems to suggest so, because Bartimaeus, the preeminent symbol of a true Markan disciple, identifies Jesus as the son of David when he calls out to him. And so what seems to be going on again is that there's some kind of play with hierarchy. The David is important, and being the son of David is important, but it's not because of specialness or uniqueness, it's shared. Remember, the disciples got off all the way back in chapter 2 when Jesus compared them to David himself. They were like David. They could eat on the Sabbath. They could do things that sovereigns are able to do because they're sovereigns. The disciples took that the wrong way. They thought it meant that they were special over other people, as opposed to everybody being in this together. And so Jesus is the model Messiah who came not to be served, but to serve. And so the crowd is glad. The scribes have to be watched because they are devouring widows' houses. And widows' houses are fatherless houses also. And the scribes are identified then all the way back in chapter 4 with the birds who gobble up the seeds. They are the ones that are devouring the seed before they even have any chance to grow. And so they will receive the greater condemnation.
Now, that idea of the widow works beautifully for the last passage we have to look at. Father Mike, can you share that reading again? It will be preached on 32nd week of the year. So this one reading that we've just read, that Robert read, that Father Mike's going to read, it is a consecutive read in the lectionary coming up at the end of the year. Father Mike.
And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the multitude putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who were contributing to the treasury. For all they contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, her whole living."
We did get to the end of the chapter, and now we have the pleasure of being able to look at it again, wrapping it up. Robert, what's the first thing that's going to be a connection for you, the way Mark decides to close out the part before he starts the apocalyptic discourse in chapter 13? What's going on right now?
Well, it's difficult to know whether this widow is being held up as a positive symbol or a negative symbol. I think the evidence is fairly strongly on the side of she being held up as a negative example, because the widow's houses are being devoured. She's participating in the contemporary religious economic institutions of the day, and so she is caught in this project of exploitation by the establishments. And so the rich give a lot of money, but the rich proportionally maybe don't give a lot of money, because that's the contrast that's being made here. And so that the poor are again exploited. So it's not wow, look at how generous and great this woman is. It's much more look how terrible this institution is that sets inequity in such strong terms, and then adds religion, and makes it all the more lamentable.
Father Mike, that passage about the woe to the scribes, beware the scribes who go around in long robes, salutations in marketplaces, best seats at church. It says synagogues, but I think we mean churches now, and places in honor of feasts. How is this something that we could be dealing with better, or even taking it seriously is more the question, because so many other things we really take seriously about the Scriptures. That must be a terrible text to really deal with all the time. I mean, not just priests, all of us, we like to be held up. How do we work to help ourselves not be putting ourselves forward?
Well, it's always a difficult text every time I read it, because it reminds me, and certainly a lot of us who are in the church today in clerical circles, I mean, you know, long robes, of course, became a part of our symbolism. Being called Father every time, everywhere you walk, every place they know who you are. You live in a small community before you know it. You're a public figure. As a public figure, everything you say, do, everything you eat, everything you buy is watched and so on. So it is a whole sense of how do you relate to people? Do you exploit your position? You know, you can be a public figure and be of service and be someone known for integrity. You can also be a public servant who is known for being misuse of power and misuse of many other things. So it's a constant pricking on the conscience of all of us and how we live, whether or not be priest, bishop, whether or not we be laymen and women in power, whatever it is. How do we conduct ourselves? And Jesus obviously had a hard time with people who use their positions of power, and especially those who are marked out by dress, by title, by all of those things. We had that discussed earlier, and it's easy to be equated with the rich who do not, people who, if you will, abuse others by their power and by the lack of trust that people may have in there. And certainly today, more than ever, it's a constant reminder that discipleship is of service, and we are called to service, not to lord over others the positions that have been given to us.
I want to thank Father Mike not only for that very good, profound insight into the implications of this for our church today, but for Dr. Robert Maldonado, who every week helps us see the depth of what Mark is sharing with us. We'll be back again next week, and we're going to be starting chapter 13, which is what we call the little apocalypse, the apocalyptic discourse. Stay tuned. We'll be back again next week.